This is Ilm Circle, a learning workshop presented by the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, or ISBA. Ilm stands for Intentional Learning for Mutual Respect, the foundation of what ISBA is all about.
Hello and welcome to this month's Ilm Circle. My name is Michelle Marion and I'm a longtime board member of ISBA. Today we're diving deep into the supernatural world of the Djinn. They're described as spirits that can appear in human form and animal form, kind of like angels except with a lower rank. We're encouraging you to ask questions and we'll address those questions later in the show. Tonight, our very special guest is Rabia Chowdhury. Rabia is an attorney, an author of the best-selling book Adnan's Story, the executive producer of the HBO documentary The Case Against Adnan Syed. Rabia, thank you so much for being here. And we know that you host a number of podcasts, and we will be talking about those a little bit later in the show. But the one that's drawing our interest tonight is the hidden Djinn.
Some say they are the eternal, mortal enemy of mankind. Others say they're so similar to us that we can befriend them. Like us, they're born and they die. Like us, they fall in love, marry, have children. And like us, they hate and fight and destroy.
So to our listeners, as you have questions, please feel free to put the questions in the chat. And as I said, we'll address those a little later in the show. So let's start with a basic question, Rabia. Could you tell us what exactly are Djinn?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know if I came through earlier, but I did want to say good evening and salam to everybody having me. Yeah, so what are the Jinn? I mean, look, as a Muslim, I grew up with stories about Jinn. The Jinn are referred to in the Muslim scripture, the Quran, almost 30 times. There is an entire chapter written called Al-Jinn. So from the Islamic perspective, the Jinn are a creation of God, just like humankind is a creation of God, just like the angels are a creation of God. And they are mentioned specifically and repeatedly on that this is an entire kind of race of beings that God created. And as God created mankind out of clay, whether that's literal or figurative or whatever, that he created the angels out of light, and he created the Jinn out of something like a smokeless flame. And so they have the properties of flames and wind and scorching wind, excuse me. And so they are considered to be an actual existing ancient species that predates the creation of Adam and mankind.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Very fascinating origins. And how do Jinn differ from ghosts or spirits or demons?
Well, I mean, look, if you were to ask a Muslim about a ghost or a spirit or a demon, say, oh, those are all just Jinn that are manifesting in different ways and that are being understood by people in different ways because of their own cultural context. So and it's a little bit of a joke, but it's also kind of serious. When there's something that's completely inexplicable, we're like, it's probably a Jinn. And the Jinn are not like one kind, just in the way that you understand human beings to be. There can be evil Jinn, there are good Jinn, there are all kinds, and there are Jinn of different religions. There are pagan Jinn, and the Jinn come in many, many different shapes and forms, and they can shapeshift. So there might be Jinns that manifest as demonic because they are truly evil. There might be Jinns that manifest as a haunting in a home because they have some attachment to a place, and so people experience that as a poltergeist or as a ghost. So I don't know how you can say it's different necessarily, but I can say from the Muslim perspective, we all end up often categorizing it all as like different kinds of Jinn, frankly.
Okay, all right, that makes sense to me. A nice umbrella term, right?
Yeah.
And so
I
could
mean, I
you
think
tell
it's in my
us,
first episode.
sure, go
Sorry, I know
ahead.
there's a bit of a lag. I was saying, I think in my first episode, I set it up a little bit like that. Like, UFOs. Oh, Jinn. David Blaine, the magician David Blaine, probably a Jinn. Like we just lump it together.
Yep. Yep. No, that's totally understandable. And so what kind of piqued your interest in this particular subject?
Gosh, well, I've always, I mean, people who know me mostly because of my legal work or the Adnan Syed case, which is very well known, or other stuff that I've done in the community. But I mean, like many people, I have lots of diverse interests, and I grew up loving folklore and the supernatural and reading a lot about it and just consuming that was like, yeah, yeah, I mean, okay, we believe in this stuff, but they didn't really. If I asked my father, do you have any Jinn stories? He would say, no, I don't have any Jinn stories. Like it wasn't like my thirst for like these stories just wasn't satisfied through my family. But about 5 or 6 years ago, I began listening to a podcast called Lore. And Lore is one of my favorite shows. And by a man named Aaron May. I met Aaron and we became friends. And his show is all about folklore that's from North America and Europe. And so when I asked if he was interested in, and I started explaining to him huge body of folklore, this creature called the Jinn, and it exists in the Middle East and Africa, all across the world. And he was fascinated, but he said that, you know what, I don't want as a white Caucasian guy to be like going into these subject areas that I know nothing about and just messing it all up. And a couple years passed, and then he reached out and said, I would love to produce something like this if you would do this. And at
Mhm.
the time, I think I had finished writing my book, and I wanted to do something that was a little more creative and not so serious. Um, and I already owned like a stack of books about gin. I said, you know what, let's do it. And
Oh,
so that's how the podcast came about. It was just going to be kind of a creative, less serious project than what I usually work on.
okay. All right. Sounds
Yeah,
wonderful. You'll have to give us some recommendations, maybe of some books for our listeners and for all of us to follow up on. If you think of, one or two that would be a
sure.
nice introductory um, book for us.
Sure.
So, as you mentioned, jinn are mentioned in the Quran. And in fact, the Quran, as you said, specifically confirms their existence. And so in the Quran, in the specific surahs and ayahs, how are they referred to? And then what should we take away from the jinn being mentioned in the Quran?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? How are they referred to just in general?
How
Is
are
that what
they
you're asking?
referred to in the Quran specifically? Are there specific surahs or are there specific ayahs?
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah.
then what should we
Um,
take away from them being mentioned?
yeah, I guess, so, the one ayah, and I quote this, I think maybe even in that intro that you made, it's chapter 15 of the Quran, and I think it's verse like 26, 27. And
Mhm.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in that verse that we created man out of clay, and then the jinn we created from a scorching fire. And then Allah goes on to say that, when he created man out of clay, he commanded the angels to prostrate. This is the story of Adam. He commanded the angels to
Mhm.
prostrate, and that there was one who all of them did except for one. And that one goes on to become known as Shaitan, Iblis, Satan. Now, I know in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Satan is often referred, like understood to be a fallen angel. In
Mhm.
most of the Islamic traditions, and there's some debate about this, Satan is understood to be actually that he was a jinn who was so pious, he was so righteous that he rose into the ranks of angels. Like he was like the uh, most devout, fervent worshiper of God, and he was so devout that he rose into the ranks of angels. And then he refused to prostrate to God. And one of the interesting things about that whole narrative is the argument by some people I mean, it's an old argument that in some ways Satan was like the original monotheist because he said, I will only bow to God. I'm not bowing to this this clay form that Adam, God made. So I thought that was really fascinating. So that story is really important in terms of the creation, the origin story. But in Surah Jinn, God explains that that the jinn are created in different tribes, and I mean, like I said, like almost like 30 times maybe they're mentioned. What we're supposed to take away from that is, I think, the really interesting question, like why is God even telling about them? I think part of it is there because there will be some interaction between the human world and the jinn world. That's the expectation, that human beings will, even though the jinn are invisible to us, unless they want to manifest in some way, they can. They are much more powerful than us. They live many longer. I mean, they live thousands of years. And I'm talking about these are the beliefs around the jinns, whether or not believes that these are the beliefs about what that race of beings is like. And it could just be that God wanted us to know. Part of it could be that God wanted us to know like what we were experiencing when we experienced different things. And it could also be that God had to that it was a inextricable part of the story of of Satan, which is a story we have to know, because obviously, where there's good there's evil, and we have to understand this evil and guard ourselves from that evil. So in order to understand the story of Satan, God had to tell us the story of jinn. So that could be why. But what's really interesting to me is, as I've done this show, and it's gotten, I think, a couple million downloads at this point. And the listeners are all over the spectrum. I would say most listeners are not Muslim. But I have, even today, I got an email from a woman who's Hindu, and I've gotten email of every single imaginable background possible, ethnically and religiously, who have said every one of these stories resonates. Like, not urinating under trees. Our elders told us that. People from completely different backgrounds, not Muslim. That there's so many similar stories and experiences people have, but in one culture it's called one thing, in another culture it's called another. So there is some universality to this, even though, and I make the case. I do a lot of. I make the case that there are very, very strong Christian Judeo traditions that relate directly to the jinn as well, and so it's a interesting common story to share when you're in those circles. They just not all Christians and Jews are aware of it, though.
Yeah, no, and the first time that I had heard of jinn, I was on a program in Morocco, and it's part of the mythology and the folklore of Morocco, and was quite fascinated. And so when I was asked to host tonight, I was, oh yes, of course, I would like to know more. So thank you. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
hope our listeners are enjoying this kind of the history and the connection to the Abrahamic religions, and understanding this as
Yeah.
well.
I mean,
So
there's even connections to, like, Celtic lore. There's a lot of Celtic, or fairies, which we're all kind of familiar with, and like in a popular understanding of fairies. Fairies were understood in Celtic lore to actually be fallen angels. And when you read those, like kind of the old Celtic lore, it's very, very similar to some of the old Jewish apocryphal and also Muslim traditions around how the angels fell and when and why.
yeah, fascinating. So yeah, so we definitely need to roll our sleeves up on this topic a little bit more, and learn some additional connections. So this might seem as a strange question, but can you actually summon a jinn, or control them, or have them, or do they try to control you, or can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Uh, the answer is yes, and it can go both ways. Look, the original jinn, they're called jinn binders. People who can summon and control the jinn, they call them binders. And also, there are people who perform exorcisms. The original jinn binder was King Solomon himself. And that story exists in the Old Testament. It exists in Islamic tradition, that God gave King Solomon this power through a ring, the ring that had the seal of Solomon on it, to command the jinn. And using that power, he summoned all the jinn in the entire world, and then he enslaved them, and that didn't go well because they hold an ancient grudge against mankind for the enslavement. But that he built these ancient cities. The splendors of King Solomon's world were apparently built by the jinn. And there are, especially in Jewish tradition, like very detailed stories about the names of the jinn, what they looked like. So he was the original jinn binder. But since that time, the tetragrammaton, which is this that also know as a Star of David, but it's an 8-point star, or is it a 6-point star? 8-point star, excuse me. I think I'm confused now. But that is supposed to hold the original, like the most power to control the jinn. There are lots of different incantations. There are some very ancient, like summoning rituals, and you find people all over the world um, who claim to not just be able to see jinn and experience jinn in their everyday lives. In fact, um, I think I did 10 episodes on the hidden jinn, in which I have researched and narrated. Then there are bonus episodes which are running right now, and they're all interview episodes. And I talk to scholars and all kinds of people who have had some kind of personal experience with jinn. And the very last bonus episode, and I don't know if it's aired yet, is with a woman based out of California who performs jinn exorcisms, but also has said that she, for much of her life, has been able to she sees them everywhere, and it's very disruptive to her, so she doesn't go out much. And so there are people who have this power. A lot of times the power is not used for good. In a lot of societies, in Muslim culture societies, whether it's Morocco, Middle East, Africa, South Asia, sometimes people will go to these people, give them money, and say, I want to use the power of a jinn to cause harm to somebody. Or sometimes they'll go to them and say, I feel like I'm harmed by a jinn, and I need you to help me get rid of the jinn. And obviously, that can lead to all kinds of abuse and exploitation by charlatans and stuff. So yeah, it's and when I told my husband I would be doing this show, he said to me, and my husband has a background in Islamic Islamic learning, like he has a degree in Islamic studies. He said, Rabia, do you know that if you mention the jinn, they come to listen? You're like splitting them. He's like, you're going to open a portal to something in our house if you do this. Um, and I said, oh, I don't think I will, but maybe it's a very common saying that if you talk about the jinn, they come to listen. So maybe summoning them is pretty easy.
Interesting. And would you ever summon, or would someone ever summon for help with a certain situation, not like a bad situation as you exemplified, but they would say, I'm stressing over my bar exam, and so could I, have some help, say from a particular jinn,
Right?
to make me feel better, guide me through this.
Yeah. Well, the general understanding is that you shouldn't ever summon jinn, because
Okay.
the jinn that are open to communicating with humans are not the ones you want communicating with you. There's a understanding that if a jinn, generally the jinn are supposed to keep in their world and we're supposed to keep in our world, but if a jinn crosses over, it's because they're not a good, they might be an evil jinn, or they're not the kind of jinn you want to interact with. So, but I have heard stories about jinn who are protective, but not necessarily that they've been summoned for that. So for the most part, it is considered haram. It's considered forbidden to actually summon jinn. You're not supposed to do that.
Okay. All right. Good. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
Because in like Christianity, you may have a saint that you would ask for guidance. And so, just so that our
Yeah.
listeners know that there is a difference between, praying to a saint in Christianity versus actually asking a jinn
Yeah.
to, come into your life and summon them. So,
Yeah. Oh,
good, good
look, I mean, like,
distinction there.
especially, yeah, no, look, in the Sufi tradition, strong tradition of asking saints who have passed and saints who are living to intercede for you. You pray, you ask them to make prayer on your behalf, even if they're deceased. So you have something similar happening, but those are saints,
Mhm.
and saints are people, human beings that lived and then died, but not
Sure.
jinn. Yeah, totally different situation. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. And do you have any examples or where there's proof or there's evidence that exists of jinn? Have you run across that in your research?
I mean, it's like asking evidence for the existence of God, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's largely a matter of faith. So, but as a Muslim, if I believe in the Muslim creed, I cannot say all of it but this. This is in my scripture. It is literally part of my creed, and I cannot reject it. I simply can't. So if I'm
Mhm.
an observant, practicing Muslim, then I accept everything that's in the scripture, and that's in the scripture. It's as simple as that. So if I accept, and one of the things I talk about is, and I talk about this mostly in my kind of my interview series, is like, if I'm already somebody who believes in God, I mean, are they generally that fantastical to believe in? I mean, come on. I mean, if I believe in, you know what I mean? Like the idea of God is much more maybe harder to understand and believe than something like this, right? So I feel
Mhm.
like the ship on what's believable and believable has sailed if you already somebody in God anyways. Um, but in terms of proof, people have I get so many stories from people who are like, I have two jinn companions. This is, experiences I've had. I have a friend. She works in the finance sector. She's a perfectly reasonable, capable, smart, intelligent woman.
Mhm.
And she has told me experiences that she's had. She's like, ever since she was a teenager, she's there, she has been experienced not jinn in the sense that something is moving or she hears something, but she actually sees them. She will see them appear around her and then disappear. And I don't think there's any mental illness involved. There's no drugs involved. So other than, but how do you scientifically prove that what she's saying is true, right? You either have to believe a person or not believe a person. Yeah.
True. Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. And sometimes I think people are just more sensitive and in tune with certain elements of our life, and other people, they don't have that same level of sensitivity. And she may have that level of sensitivity that some other folks do not.
Yeah, they
So,
say, for some people, the veil between the worlds is thinner. And
um,
for somebody like me, even I am a believer, but still the veil is pretty thick for me. Like I don't experience anything, even though
mhm.
I'm kind of sort of open to it, but it's not happening for me. And other people, yeah, for other people, I guess the veil is pretty thin.
Great, great. So, and you said that you had been interviewing a variety of people, and some folks had been sharing their stories. Would you be able to share one or two of the most unusual jinn stories that you've heard in your interview process?
Gosh, I'll share. Gosh, I don't know which one to share. I'll share one story that was shared, and it's in my interview series. And the woman who shared it with me is a journalist. She's a professional journalist. Her name is Shaheen Basha, and she runs this amazing program called the Prison Journalism Project. And I joked with her and others too. I'm like, we're all doing this amazing professional work, and we're totally destroying our credibility by sharing these stories. But here we are. We'll listen to them and say what's going on with these people. So she shared a story about how her family had a home in which there was a basement, and since childhood, she had experienced, her and others had experienced seeing this really terrifying female figure in that basement. And the figure was had hair that covered like the front of the face, or it was very long and stringy, and it was like an old decrepit figure of an old woman. And they had
Mhm.
guests that would stay there sometimes, and say, I'm never staying there again. I this thing, I don't know if it was a dream, I don't know if it was real. So Shaheen had experienced it herself, seen it herself. She got married, and her husband didn't believe in any of this. They moved to Dubai, and they
Mhm.
moved into an area that was apparently, she didn't know this, but was built. It was a pretty new. construction, I mean, a pretty new subdivision, but it had been built on top of like an old cemetery or something. They didn't know this for a while, but then some news stories emerged about how there were all weird happenings in this subdivision. So in the home they were in, they started experiencing these weird. It was a two-level home, I think, and so the bedrooms are on top. And at night, suddenly they would hear very clear footsteps coming up the stairs. Like her children heard it, her husband heard it. Yeah, and after like this happening a couple of times, they were also terrified that the husband, like the whole family, would sleep in one bed in the master bedroom and lock the door, keep a baseball bat because they didn't know what was going on. Yeah, they didn't know. It's like they're an intruder coming in at night. What's happening? So one night, again, they're in bed and Shaheen wakes up. She hears these footsteps. She wakes up her husband. Her husband hears it. And then they hear like the door rattling or something. So he opens up the door and he doesn't see anything there. And so he goes down the stairs. And then when he looks up the stairs, he saw the figure of that old woman. He just had like, he just freaked out and he ran to his wife and he goes, there was an old woman here and her hair was like this and she was wearing this. And Shaheen said, that's the woman I have seen since I was a child in my home in New Jersey. So Shaheen wasn't sure, is this like an it's followed her? And so that was a really terrifying story for me. And I think they eventually moved out, but I'm not quite sure like how that ended. But the whole family experienced that together.
Oh my. Yeah, the children will not forget that anytime soon.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and we have those experiences, and it can happen to anyone. So you believe in Jinn, yes?
I mean, I have to. It is literally a part of my faith. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think most of us, if we either approach it in that same way that you do, it's part of my faith, or we approach it as, I don't disbelieve. I haven't had any experiences, but I don't disbelieve either. And so do you have
Right.
any Jinn stories or experiences of your own, even just like that feeling of a presence that was maybe, like you said, your veil might be a little bit thicker, but you still had a feeling of a presence?
I've never felt a presence, but I had something happen to me that was, I had no way to explain other than it had to be Jinn. I mean, I don't know what else it was. And what happened was that I was a single, I had been married and I got divorced. I was a single mother at this time. I lived in a one-bedroom condo with my 6-year-old daughter, and my cousin was staying with me for about 6 months, and she was 16, 17. And so both the girls went to the same school, and every morning I would drop them off at the school. It was a private Islamic school. I would come back home, get ready, and then go to my job as at the general counsel's office in DC. So one morning I was just sitting on the sofa. It was very early, like 7 a.m. And I was trying to make a call overseas. And this is back in the day when we all used to use these calling cards. And the calling
Oh.
cards are heavily laminated in a plastic. You can't really tear them. Maybe you can tear it in half, but it's hard. Trying to make a call and I couldn't through. So I put the phone and the calling card on the sofa and I said to the girls, let's go. You're getting late. I got to come back and get ready. So I took them out. About 10 minutes later, I come back into the house after I dropped them off because I had to get ready for work. And as soon as you enter, the sofa's right next to the door. And I looked at it and the phone is there, but the calling card has been shredded into like tiny, I don't even know how to explain it, like little flakes. Like human hands could not have shredded.
Wow.
It was just in a little mound of like powder. And I was like, nobody was at home. I was gone for 10 minutes. And I have no idea how. A friend of mine's like, you probably had an intruder. I said, why would an intruder do that of all things? And also how you couldn't even do, maybe you could do it with a pair of scissors if you spent a lot of time because it was just a tiny little mass of powder. I didn't understand that. I didn't understand what was happening. My mother said, there's definitely something in that house. You got to recite this. And I was fine. Nothing happened, but that was a really weird experience that I couldn't explain.
Yeah, definitely very strange. I remember those calling
Yeah,
cards. Yeah, definitely.
yeah, yeah.
And so you mentioned at the start of our program tonight that Jinn do have lifespans. And what is like the typical range of a lifespan, or is it just dependent upon the individual Jinn?
Yeah, apparently, I mean, like, within the jinn, I guess, I don't know, creation, there are different kinds of jinn. There are different tribes of jinn. They
Mhm.
manifest in different ways. But apparently, many of them are like ancient by human standards. And it is said that the jinn, many of the jinn that Solomon enslaved are still today. Like they live thousands and thousands of years. It's not that they can't die or they don't die. And sometimes they die at the hands of a human being. Even people can kill
Oh,
jinn.
okay.
Sometimes inadvertently jinn can be killed, and that can cause like a feud basically. But the general understanding is that they live thousands of years, and because they live thousands of years, and because they're so fast, that they can be in many places, like within seconds,
Mhm.
be in different places in the entire universe. That they're able to. It's interesting. One way that Muslims understand the ability of psychics and fortune tellers, like when they get something right, and they piece together things, is that it's said that they're usually either working with jinn, and so that jinn, which has lived thousands of years, they know everything. They can, and they have this incredible network of information. Like they can connect to huge jinn network and get information from anywhere at any time. So they're able to provide details about a person's life to that fortune teller that person then can use to convince, the target that this is and then uh, come up with something or get some money out of them, or make up a story about what's going to happen to them in the future. So yeah, they have a different abilities. But what's interesting is that what I find fascinating in terms of the relationship between jinn and humans is that God still says in the scripture that human beings are my most noble, greatest creation. So
Mhm.
even despite the jinn having these incredible powers, like the kind of powers that we think about as superhuman and superheroes have, and we'd love to have, that we are actually much superior to jinn because we have intellectual abilities that they don't have. The jinn are not able to imagine things. They're not able to, um, uh, they don't have intellectual capabilities that we do. They have physical strengths, but they don't have the ability to create things the way we can create.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
And apparently, I was just going to say, apparently that was also has been a point of great offense for some jinn, that they, even though they created a fire and they're much more powerful, that God still doesn't consider them to be superior to us. That
okay. All right, great. I think we need to bring in some questions from our audience members tonight. So I think we are ready for those. And I'll read them once I can see them kind of scrolling in here. There we go. So in the Jewish tradition, Satan is an angel whose name, wait a minute, because it's right in my own picture is in the way. It stands for the opponent as well as in the devil's advocate. The fallen angel understanding is Christian. And so kind of a clarification, I think, from what you had originally said as far as, how those two religions kind of overlap a little bit.
right, right, right.
And our next question, is there a connection between the jinn and the evil eye? And I understand the evil eye, especially within Turkey. I understand it as a cultural tradition there, but is there a question between the jinn and the evil eye?
Not in the way that I have been raised. Something that you get from other people. It
Okay.
comes from a place of jealousy. It comes from a place of envy. It's basically envy that manifests in some way. protect yourself from the envy of others. And sometimes it's not even there might be no maliciousness in the envy. It could just be somebody who in their heart, like they're genuinely happy for something that you have or you've done, but there's still this little place in their heart that they wish that they did too, and so that can manifest. So just protect yourself from the envy of others. That's how the evil eye is understood in my cultural tradition, at least, and doesn't have anything to do with the jinn.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you for that clarification there. In the Jewish Bible, summoning the supernatural outside of petitioning the eternal is forbidden. Is there any prohibition in Islam against seeking the help of a jinn?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. As I mentioned before, it's most scholars consider it completely forbidden to do that.
Mhm.
Dabbling in any of that is considered haram and forbidden. We're not supposed to do that. Yeah,
Okay. All right. Thank you. Great question.
yeah. Especially and lots of reasons for it. I think, one of the reasons is also you don't really know what you're doing. I mean, you could summon something that you don't know how to send back or you can't control. Something could enter your life and ruin it for generations, right? Like you don't know, we don't know what we're doing. And also, if you are a believer in God, then God expects you to come to him with all of your asks and not go anywhere else, right? So I think
Mhm.
there's a little bit of both of those things.
Okay. All right. Great. And then I had a question because I listened to about 3 or 4 of the podcasts in my preparation to be host tonight. And in the first one, the podcast "We Are Not Alone" episode, you mentioned jinn having particular colors, and I was curious if the colors are specific to particular behaviors, or are they just kind of in general in the specific colors?
Honestly, that's not a question that I'm even clear on. When I spoke to different scholars about kind of how jinn are categorized, and there's really
Mhm.
no clear answer. People
Okay.
speculate. In different traditions, jinn are referred to as like people categorize them as the jinn of the air, the jinn of the water, the jinn of, in other traditions, they're categorized like by color. And I couldn't find a whole lot of information on the color thing. And that's not that I had ever heard growing up myself. I heard it as what I read about it for researching this series was that it's more of a Malaysian or Indonesian tradition. It comes from that source. But having said that, there are, there is a there's a folklore, a story. I don't even know how to what to call it, about like the 7 kings of the jinn, and each one of them, if you look up the 7 jinn kings, each one of them is associated with a color, a planet, a day of the week. And it's really interesting. Every single one has a different, one of them is all about bringing sickness to people. One of them does other things. One of them causes problems in marriages. They all have their specialty, different ways of causing chaos in humans' lives. Um, so yeah, that was in that situation. I did see some, but I didn't really. Um, I haven't found too much about like the significance of their color otherwise.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I was listening and careful, and I thought, I wonder if that denotes anything with regard to behavior, like if it's a blue gin, like their behavior would be kind of solemn and maybe they were dealing with something spiritually themselves, or if it was a white,
Mm,
it might be, I don't know,
yeah.
because that's the presence of all colors. They might be more lively or something of that nature. I just was kind of curious. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I
So,
haven't seen
and
anything. Yeah, I haven't seen anything like that.
okay. All right. Well, we'll see as the
Mm.
research continues, right? And my producer has a question. In Western culture, a ghost is a deceased person who returns in spiritual form. How are ghosts then jinn, since they're ancient beings? So how does maybe that work?
Right. They can mimic other human beings and cause a lot of havoc that way. So they can mimic the appearance of other human beings, both living and deceased. They can mimic their voices. So there's actually a particular kind of jinn that's able to do that. Um, And I talk about, I think maybe it's in my first or second episode, the jinn that we're all born with, that each one of us is actually born with
Mhm.
jinn that lives with us our whole life and then dies with us. And I'm most fascinated maybe with that jinn because it's like our personal jinn and they know everything about you. Um,
Sure.
so they know if one of those jinn wanted to manipulate you, how to get to you. And that might be by appearing as the ghost of your dead grandmother, right? Now, in the Muslim tradition, I don't know of any Islamic source, like sound Islamic source, that would authenticate the ability of the soul of the deceased to return to the world, and interact with the world again. I mean,
Mhm.
my understanding has always been that when a human being dies, their soul enters um, a realm. I guess you could say it's kind of like purgatory, or it's called I think Alam Barzakh, but it's like the before the Judgment Day realm, and you're kind of in that limbo there until Judgment Day, and at that point, judged heaven and hell and all that, but not necessarily the souls can return. So I haven't heard anything, and I just may not know. So that's how I think we kind of understand that if you're experiencing what might seem to be a ghost, it might be something else pretending to be a ghost.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. And this listener says, I'm having difficulty distinguishing between the scholarly understanding of the phenomenon and then the folklore or the mythology. So could you embellish just a little
Yeah.
bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to sometimes distinguish it. I mean, from an Islamic perspective, at least, if you want the scholarly information, you go to scholarly sources, and there's a lot of scholarly sources Islamically, beginning with the Quran itself, right? So the Quran's telling us these beings exist. Okay, so that's like a given. So we know that this is something we believe that God is telling us, and it's the truth. So then where do you go from there? There are lots of writings by theologians and scholars who have written extensively about the jinn. And the folklore comes in, I think. It's hard sometimes. The line is pretty thin because sometimes what scholarly sounds like folklore,
Mhm.
but and what's folklore also is something that's being interpreted through a cultural lens, through the context of a particular time and place, versus something that's
Mhm.
coming straight from, right, a scholarly source. So but it all kind of, to me, operates in tandem, because at the end of the day, it's about what human beings believe or don't believe, and why they
Okay.
believe it. And um we many of us believe in folklore for lots of different reasons, and sometimes we can be completely not religious people and ascribe to no faith, and we still believe in folklore because there are experiences we cannot understand without it. So there's a couple of books that I can recommend. One of them
Mhm.
that I used heavily for this, well, the two that I used the most, one is by Robert Lebling, Lebling, and it's fantastic. It's called Legends of the Fire Spirits.
Okay.
Again, it's Robert Lebling. And the second one is by a scholar named Amira Al Zain, and I think she's based in Saudi or the Gulf right now. And her last name is spelled Elzein, Amira Al Zain. And her book is called Islam, Arabs, and the Intelligent World of the Jinn. And it's actually a completely scholarly work. Whereas Robert Lebling's book kind of back and forth between folklore and scholarly sources.
Okay. Thank you so much for those recommendations. Very helpful for all of us who are curious to learn more. So we appreciate that tremendously.
Yeah.
So, Rabia
And for folks,
Chaudhry,
I
go ahead.
oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to
No, no,
say
go ahead.
that if you yeah, for people who really want like more sources too, if you Google the Hidden Gin podcast, it'll take you to
Mhm.
the website called Grim and Mild. Grim and Mild is the production company that helped create the show. It's Aaron Mankey's company. And then if you go to that website, it'll say sources. It'll say on, and then you can go to different episodes. So it'll say episode sources. You click on episode sources. You pick an episode, and for every episode that I did, I listed all the sources on that page. And so many of the sources you can find online, and some of the books that you can order. So there's plenty of reading material out there.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Yes. And for all of our listeners, the podcast, when I was on last week, there's 19 episodes that are listed and available as of last week. I'm not sure if there's an additional one since then. And they're quite fascinating. I will say that, Rabia, your storytelling ability in the podcast is equivalent to Scheherazade. It was quite fascinating, and just your ability to deliver it. It was so soothing and so interesting that I was actually absolutely riveted. So, and all I could think of
Thank you so much.
well, this is like Scheherazade. And no wonder, that every day,
Thank you so much.
the Sultan could not wait for the next story. And that's how I felt when I was listening to your podcast. So I appreciate it. So
that means a lot. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Additional podcasts though. So are those also available, and how can we explore the podcast Undisclosed, which is about the Adnan Syed story, and then also your 45th, the podcast that examines the development out of the White House? How do we access those?
Well, I am very thankful that we got to wrap up the 45th when the 46th administration was inaugurated. But it exists in an archive, and if you want to revisit the Trump years, it's all there. So week by week, we examined the policies every week and the news around the administration. Me and another co-host who's also an attorney. Undisclosed has been around now for 6 years. We have over 300 episodes. We have worked in over 20 cases, and we've helped exonerate 10 people so far. And so Adnan was the first case we did, but not the last case. We have been continuously, it's three attorneys. Just look up Undisclosed Podcast. It's available on every podcast app. If you're interested in how the law works in true crime, in some of the most egregious but fascinating stories of how things can go so desperately wrong in a conviction, you have to check out Undisclosed. Most people have maybe only heard Adnan Syed's story when it comes to wrongful convictions. Believe me, his story is not the craziest one out there. And this is much more common than you think, and people can fall through the cracks very, very easily. So that is the core of my work, is the innocence work now that we're doing. Yeah.
Wonderful. And wonderful
and
work.
It's an ongoing
it
series. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
that's
Hidden
Djinn was Hidden Djinn was a limited, but Undisclosed is an ongoing series.
Okay. All right. Well, Rabia, thank you so very much for joining us tonight. It's been a real pleasure to be able to work with you through this session. And on behalf of all of our listeners, I want to say thank you, and for making the time. I know you're not on the same time zone that I am, so it's probably a little later for you.
It's fine.
So
thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving me the chance to talk to you all.
Great, thank you. And for all of our listeners, please help the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona keep workshops like this going. If you're interested to donate, you can donate to isba-az.org, and we would appreciate any donation, large or small. So, and there's never a donation that's too small. So we appreciate anything. So thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure. And until next time.
Yeah.